Thank you everyone for coming in today. I really do appreciate it. And let's get into today's topic. So before we delve into the material, I do need to define a few terms in order to make sure that everyone knows exactly what I mean when I use each term, which will be used frequently in the presentation. The first term is open-mindedness, which is the trait of having or showing a mind receptive to new ideas and arguments. The second is rationality, which is the principle of having and exercising reason, sound judgment, and good sense. Ideology is a body of doctrine, myth, and belief that guides an individual, so social movement, institution, class, or large group. And dogma is an official system of principles or tenets concerning faith, morals, or behavior typically set by a church. So the purpose of this presentation today is to first elucidate on the dangers of ideology and dogma. Ideology and dogma are both dangerous for individuals and societies. They limit the way that we're able to interpret and evaluate the world and understand reality, and they limit us to the ideas of the ideology itself and not those ideas outside of it. Second, we also have to review how individuals can use rationality to investigate and better understand the world. Reality exists independent of our individual biases and ideologies, and so by utilizing rationality, we can better investigate and understand the world itself and have a more grounded sense of reality. Third, we need to highlight the importance of being open-minded. Rationality is only one key component in understanding reality. Being open-minded means being able to take in new information, and that new information can augment or challenge knowledge that we already have. And finally, I'd like to urge viewers to reflect on themselves and check to see if they're practicing these values themselves. As secularists, we're not immune from being irrational or from being dogmatic. And so we need to actually practice what we preach and check that we're making decisions rationally, that the knowledge that we have and the arguments that we make are rational, and that we're open-minded and able to accept new information, and encourage others to adopt and practice these principles. So my inspiration for today's talk is twofold. The first was from the 2016 US presidential election. This presidential election led to a dramatic increase in irrationality and adherence to ideology as compared to previous years in American history. And this can be seen through right-wing conspiracy theories. It can be seen through demonization of the media, of the news, of data, and of any information that conflicts with one's own perceptions of a candidate or other opposing candidates. And the sad thing about this increase in ideology and irrationality in America is that this wasn't a new phenomena. This wasn't something that just happened in 2016, and that before 2016, America was a country filled with people that were rational beings, that were open-minded to new ideas, that didn't place ideology over their attempt to understand reality. This is something that's been building up over the last few decades, and 2016 is partially a result of that. So, as far as a little bit about me goes and my own experiences with ideology and dogma, I grew up in a conventional Christian household. My parents weren't fanatical or very strongly Christian, but they were about what an average Christian would be in America. We would go to church on Sundays, say that we lived with Christian values, pray, and appeal to God during our times of need and crisis. And before high school, I never questioned why I was a Christian. It was just something that I had always been one. I was taught that from when I was a young age, and I accepted it as true. And it wasn't something that I ever sat down until high school and thought, okay, so if I have these beliefs, why do I believe them? So in my biology class in high school, I noticed that many classmates began to discount and reject material on evolution because it conflicted with biblical scripture. They rejected it because it differed from what was in the Bible, and because it disagreed with the Bible, to them, it can't be true. It's something that must be wrong in some sort of way, shape, or form. And at that moment, I began wondering, why are they rejecting this material? This isn't material that our teacher is pulling out of thin air. This is material that scientists have dedicated their lives. They're studying for decades. Something that there's a large consensus in the scientific community over the concept of evolution, the basic principles of it, and evidence from over decades that support it. And so we know that this material is true. This is material that has been discovered and tested and investigated by experts. And why reject material that we know is supported by science? It's supported by sound reasoning. It's supported by evidence. And then I began to question why I consider myself to be a Christian. And why do I believe the beliefs that I have? And is it possible that Christian tenets, such as the existence of God, can be confirmed through science? So, in general, ideology and dogma are antithetical to rationality and open-mindedness. Intellectual, philosophical discourse, and scientific inquiry require rationality and require open-mindedness. And if one is adhering to an ideology or is being dogmatic, it's difficult, actually not even difficult, it's impossible to be rational and open-minded at the same time. And so by adhering yourself to ideology and dogma, you end up forcing evidence, data, and reasoning to fit the ideology that you have, rather than letting the data speak for itself, rather than letting the evidence or reasoning speak for itself. And the thing is that reality doesn't care about what you want the world to be or your desire to be right. It exists independently of our own desires, and so by forcing evidence to support your ideology, you end up disconnecting yourself more from reality. Now, ideology and dogma suppress rationality and open-mindedness, since they're antithetical. If you can't do one and have the other. And so it also makes us closed-minded, and this goes towards suppressing open-mindedness. It keeps us from taking in new information, especially information that can challenge our views, and it keeps us from listening to other people and understanding different perspectives, and it ends up making us hostile to criticism and hostile to new information. And ultimately, ideology and dogma limits the ability of individuals to learn, because reality exists independent of any particular ideology. When you adhere yourself to those principles, you limit what you can learn. You can only learn what's acceptable to your ideology. You can only learn what is acceptable to that ideology. And so any information that's outside of that gets thrown to the wayside. Now, that's just the risk to individuals, how ideology and dogma is dangerous to individuals themselves. But it's also dangerous to societies themselves. And ideological factions tend to form ideological governments. Once they're in power, they tend to spread their ideology, and they tend to enforce it. And because of that, they tend to be autocratic. They are not tolerant of public criticism or debate, because allowing any public criticism or debate would allow questioning of the ideology itself. It allows questioning of the government and how things should be done, how representatives should act, which opens the door for change. And there are several examples of this within human history, and the first one is the Soviet Union itself, which was a totalitarian communist state ruled by a single party, the Communist Party. The government of the Soviet Union enforced adherence to communist ideology in all aspects of society: education, business, personal life, politics, and it was taught in schools as being objectively true and ideal, and all the information that was taught in schools passed through this prism of communism, of the ideology. And dissent or criticism of the ideology itself was severely punished in the Soviet Union. Nazi Germany would be another example of ideological government, where you had a totalitarian fascist state ruled by a single party, the Nazi Party. The government placed the nation above all else, and all business and citizenry must support the nation. And there was no debate over this. There was no, you must support the state. There was no other way around it. And this ideology was, again, enforced in all aspects of society, and dissent was severely punished. So if ideology and dogma are dangerous for individuals and dangerous for society at large, then how do we prevent individuals from falling into the traps of ideology and dogma? How do we prevent society from becoming ideological and dogmatic? Well, the first way is through rational thinking. And rational thinking is the best way to understand the world, because reality and the world around us exist independent of any particular ideology. And so through rational thinking, for asking ourselves, what do we know and why do we know it? How can we find out? Is the best way that we can try to understand the world, because because our primary objective is to understand it rather than try to force it to be something that it may or may not be. And what's really important, and if there's anything to take away from this presentation, I really want you to know that your argument is not valid just because it is your argument. And any argument that you make needs to be supported by data, reasoning, or evidence. And there's no way around it. Your argument, just because it's your argument, doesn't make it a sound argument. And if you don't have support for it, you need to abandon it, and people shouldn't recognize it as valid. So, when thinking about rational thinking, we also have to remember as well that we all have biases from nature and life, and that, it's inherent to human beings themselves. And so, in order to avoid the pitfalls of our own biases, to avoid the falling into our own confirmation bias, we need to minimize our biases. We need to recognize that they exist and consider different interpretations and arguments that may contradict our own biases. And by minimizing those and by being open-minded, we can better understand reality, better understand the world, because we're taking in as much information as possible and considering it from all different angles. Okay, that's not. And in general, rational thinking leads to positive and effective outcomes. When we make decisions that are based in reality, they're more likely to succeed, they're more likely to have their intended effect. And that's simply because if it's grounded in reality, then you understand the principles that will make your decision work, and you're more likely to actually achieve the goal that you want. And at the same time, this applies towards our representatives, public workers, private businesses, people in society at large, that when they make better decisions and they use rational thinking, we have better outcomes. We end up with outcomes that are more likely to benefit people at large. And so rationality by itself, though, isn't the only thing that we need to take into consideration. We also need to take into consideration open-mindedness and the idea of being open about learning new perspectives and taking in new interpretations and new information. And this is so important for challenging our own knowledge and challenging our own arguments and thoughts. And by taking in new information and new arguments and new interpretations, we can compare our own knowledge to new information. And this comparison, this examination of our own knowledge in light of new knowledge, allows us to identify faulty notions in our own thinking. Maybe we got something wrong. Maybe we overlooked something. Maybe we interpreted something in a way that maybe wasn't the best way to interpret it. Or it could also augment our own thinking, where maybe the argument that we have or the knowledge that we have is actually true. We have more evidence to support it, more reasoning, and so we can be even more sure that the knowledge that we have is sound. And without open-mindedness, we end up becoming victims of ourselves. We end up limiting ourselves with our own biases, and we end up forgetting interpretations that maybe we overlooked, or maybe we wouldn't have naturally thought of. And we end up trapping ourselves within our own biases that we can't think outside of them. And then it becomes even worse if we start associating only with people whose own views are the same as ours, who have the exact same interpretations as us, the same biases, which we end up creating an echo chamber around ourselves, where instead of having an intellectual discussion, we end up becoming yes men, and we end up supporting each other because we happen to agree with each other. And so we end up making our dissonance from reality and our own knowledge even more removed from reality. And lastly, as far as open-mindedness goes, it also promotes tolerance, and this is beneficial for both individuals and societies at large because it allows people of different intellectual, philosophical, political backgrounds to come together, discuss different opinions, engage each other, check each other's knowledge and thinking, and we get a better understanding of each other. The other people who think differently from us aren't these unknown people that are just different. We know who they are. We know why they think the way they do. And maybe we might change them, and maybe they might change us. So, conclusion. So, why is this important? Well, one of the reasons why this is important is that secularism isn't a guarantee of objectivity, rationality, and open-mindedness. It's very well possible to be part of the secular community and not embrace these principles. While we may be known for having these principles, you can perfectly be part of the community and not practice these values, and be just as bad as, for example, people who are religious and accept their religious tenets as given, or people who are ideological and accept that as given. And as well, the more people in society who embrace these values of rationality and open-mindedness, the better off society will be. We'll have more people that make rational decisions that are grounded in reality, that are more likely to have their intended effect, and thus more likely to be successful. And we're also more tolerant as well, and more accepting of people of different backgrounds, different interpretations, philosophical schools of thought, what have you. And as atheists, we can model these principles to others and encourage them to practice these values in a way acting as ambassadors of rationality, of almost spreading the good news about these values and encouraging people to actually practice them in their day-to-day life. All right, thank you everyone for coming in today. We have a few minutes for questions, right? All right, questions, anyone? Go for it.
Hey, so as a philosophy undergraduate student, I really see the value in critical thinking and being able to see, like you described, reality without biases. I think it's actually really beautiful. At the same time, I'm also studying Hispanic literature and culture in Latin America, and I also see the value of, I guess, creating a culture of, I guess, like comfort and where you have community as well. Mm-hmm. But to me, it seems like the values of rational thinking can conflict with supporting the idea of culture, and that people are so unique and culture is great to celebrate. How do you kind of, if there's many cultural groups that don't adhere to these values, how do you, I guess, like balance the two, the value of culture in the world and also the value of rational values?
So I'm not sure if there's any cultural group that is inherently irrational and that part of their culture is a celebration of irrationality specifically. Now, a cultural group may be particularly religious. The religion may have irrationality in it. Well, actually, it does have irrationality in it. But cultures can change, and cultures are made up of people, and people change as well. And by incorporating rationality and open-mindedness into their culture, the culture will change, of course, but it doesn't have to be you can either have your cake or eat it. You can, in this case, have both. The culture would change, but you still have it, and you can still be rational at the same time.
What about cultures where the ideology is so ingrained, like, not cultures necessarily, but like geographical regions where the culture is and the ideology is so ingrained that, divergence from this to rational thought and open-mindedness, making those opinions voice and trying to, have an intellectual conversation with somebody who holds these ideologies, if it could lead to like persecution or like discrimination, is that something you should still fight for and try to make a change, or should you kind of like stay under the radar?
So you're absolutely right that there are societies where if you express a dissenting opinion, whether that's in the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, could be Middle Eastern countries today, like Saudi Arabia, where you can be punished for being an atheist. Change takes time, and it has to start somewhere. And it may be tough to be the first person started, to be the one that takes the brunt for expressing new ideas that are contrary to the common knowledge, but it's important, and you have to be aware that yes, you will be punished for it, but in the long run, you'll be helping make society better off overall, and the people who come after you won't have to go through the social backlash that individual went through.
I don't believe culture is a sacred word. It can be criticized, and it can be, discussed, and if there is something good in a culture, you keep it, and if there is something bad, you get rid of it. But, you saying the word culture doesn't mean that it cannot be challenged. Culture should be challenged, any culture. So, just because you say that's their culture, that doesn't mean that, that's the way it is, and there are no changes possible, or different ways to approach it, or use it as an excuse not to do something.
So what's the question?
No, I was just making a comment.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Other questions?
How do you think it should be managed, the fact that things aren't as simple as you just think rationally and will get the most accurate model of reality?
Right, so the presentation overall was very much in the abstract, meant to be applied to all sorts of different scenarios. And as a historian, I can say, there isn't always a right argument and a wrong argument, but there are better arguments and worse arguments. And being rational doesn't mean that everyone's going to come to the exact same conclusion. Depending on the scenario and the evidence, they may come to differing interpretations that all have equal validity, or some interpretations that may have more validity, but other interpretations that, while they may not be as valid, still have some validity. So it's a principle to try to apply, but it's not a guarantee that there will always be one answer for any given scenario. All right, last question.
Senator says, it's a quote that says, if someone doesn't value evidence, what evidence are you going to provide to prove they should value it? If someone doesn't value logic, what logical argument would you provide to show the importance of the logic? How do you respond to that? How do you reach people that don't value rational thinking?
So, you can bring a horse to the water, but you can't force it to drink. And people have to be open to, changing how they think about things and being available for self-criticism and for change. And so they can do that through just living life, where if they're not getting to where they need to be, then that might inspire them to create a change. But we can also model it ourselves, and as being models of rationality and open-mindedness, maybe we can inspire them to also consider it at the same time. And so, we can reach out to those who are open, and so the ones who are not, maybe at least we can put on a good show and maybe open them up to the possibility of change. All right, thank you everyone for coming in today.